Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of The Mosquito Fleet by Bern Keating. Chapter 6: The War in Europe, Mediterranean.
While Americans and their allies were fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, on the other side of the world, their comrades in arms grappled in a titanic struggle with the other two Axis powers. Half of the European Axis partnership was half-hearted Italy, but the other half was the martial and determined state of Germany, led by an insane genius at the black arts of killing named Hitler. The naval war in the coastal waters of Europe was eminently suitable to torpedo boat operations. The British had been making spectacular use of motor torpedo boats for years. In fact, American PTs had been patterned after British models. The Axis powers also used torpedo boats. German E-boats prowled the English Channel and the Mediterranean. Even the Italian MAS boats made Allied Mediterranean naval commanders nervous, for the torpedo boat had been an Italian specialty since its invention, and the officers who manned Italian small craft were the most aggressive and warlike in all the Italian armed forces. American troops went ashore in northwest Africa on November 8, 1942. On the other side of the world, the Japanese were just forming the massive relief fleet that was smashed and dispersed definitively a week later in the Great Three-Day Sea Battle of Guadalcanal. The United States Navy rushed to put American torpedo boats into the Mediterranean to join the British in harrying Axis shipping. In New Orleans, in late 1942, Squadron 15 was organized. Its commander was Lieutenant Commander Stanley Barnes, destined to become probably the most dashing of all American PT sailors, as the squadron itself was to become the most spectacularly successful PT command in either theater. On commissioning day, the squadron members didn't feel elated about their future. Their first assignment was to patrol the warm blue waters off Midway Island, far behind the fighting lines in the Pacific. While the Tulagi PTs fought almost nightly battles with Tanaka's Tokyo Express, Squadron 15 was promised long, lazy afternoons of cribbage 3,500 miles behind the combat zone. Its assignment gave its members slight headaches every time they thought about it. Lieutenant Commander Barnes assured his squadron mates that somehow, somewhere, he was going to find somebody for them to fight. But nobody believed him, not even he, as he later confessed. The squadron sailed for the Panama Canal and was well on the way to the gentle duties of Midway when the radio man came running with a dispatch. Orders to Midway were canceled. "Report to Commander-in-Chief, Atlantic Fleet in Norfolk," the message read. At the giant Virginia Naval Base, Barnes had his conference with the upper echelons of brass and rushed back to his squadron mates with the news that they were indeed going to find somebody somewhere to fight. They were going to the Mediterranean as the first American torpedo boat squadron on the European scene. The barman at the Navy Officers Club in Norfolk was famous in those days, and may still be, for his stingers, a most appropriate toast to duty in the Mediterranean Mosquito Fleet. The 201 and 204 crossed the Atlantic immediately as deck passengers on the SS Enori, and Lieutenant Commander Barnes followed on the SS Housatonic, with 205 and 208. The Enori arrived at Gibraltar first, on April 13th. Boats were in the water the next day, and Lieutenant Edwin A. Dubose, also destined to make a name as a brilliant PT sailor, took them to the British torpedo boat dock, loaded a full cargo of torpedoes, and set sail for Oran in North Africa. Skippers of the other boats followed as fast as longshoremen could swing the PTs into the water. Disappointment awaited the crews in Oran, where the High Command sent the boats to Cherchell, 300 miles from the nearest action, for an indefinite period of training. "I decided to take the bull by the horns and bum a ride to Algiers in an army truck to see Vice Admiral Henry K. Hewitt," said Lieutenant Commander Barnes. Admiral Hewitt was commander of all U.S. naval forces in Northwest African waters, and Barnes hoped to persuade him that the PTs should be based at Bern, 265 miles farther east and within easy reach of trouble at the front. That trip took me several hours, and by the time I got there, I was chagrined to find that orders had already been issued, and Lieutenant Richard H. O'Brien, my next in command, had gotten the boats underway and was in Algiers before me. The admiral himself brought me up to date with the information that my boats were already there. Most embarrassing. The next day, April 27th, Lieutenant Dubose took his boats to the forward base at Bern, and that night they went out on their first patrol in combat waters. Bern was also the British forward base for motor torpedo boats and gunboats. Like the American PTs, the British MTBs carried torpedoes, but the British had already converted some patrol craft to gunboats, similar to the heavily gunned PTs of New Guinea. The gunboats carried no torpedoes. The British had been fighting in the Mediterranean for months, so American PTs made most of their early patrols with British officers aboard to tip them off to local conditions. The North African campaign was drawing to a close. General Erwin Rommel's Crack Africa Corps was bottled up in Tunisia, and torpedo boats patrolled nightly to prevent escape of Rommel's soldiers to Sicily, just 90 miles across the strait from Tunisia's Cape Bon. Lieutenant Commander Barnes, in the 106, joined 3 British torpedo boats under Lieutenant Dennis Germain in a patrol down the east side of Cape Bon. At Ras Ida Bay, Lieutenant Germain took 1 British MTB inside the harbor to investigate a possible target. Lieutenant Commander Barnes continues the story. Pretty soon, Germain came up on the radio with the startling statement that there are lots of ships in there, so I took the remaining British boats with me and started in. It was as black as the inside of your pocket, but sure enough, right there in front of me was a ship. By the time we saw it against the dark background of the land, we were inside the torpedo aiming range and had to go all the way around the other side of it before getting a good shot. Thinking there were other targets around, I lined up and fired only 1 torpedo. Our first. It ran hot and straight, and after what seemed like an interminable time, made a beautiful hit forward. The whole ship blew up in our faces, scattering pieces of debris all around us and on deck. Just like the movies. We immediately started to look for other ships, but could find none. Neither could we find our British friend, who, it turned out, was temporarily aground, so we just eased around trying to rendezvous. Pretty soon he found us and promptly fired 2 fish at us, one of which passed right under our bow and the other under the stern, much to our alarm and his subsequent embarrassment. About half an hour later, bombers started working over the airfield a couple of miles away, and with the light of the flares we managed to join up with Germain. I personally think that ship was aground, the ship we torpedoed, although it certainly made a fine spectacle going up, and one of our officers who was along that night subsequently flew over the area in a plane and reported it sitting nicely on the bottom. Actually, Germain had not seen any ships and had mistaken some peculiar rock formations for a group of enemy vessels. That was not the last mistake of the British Navy. Unused to working with their new allies, the British boats took one more near-lethal crack at American PTs. Lieutenant Dubose, in Lieutenant Junior Grade Eugene S. Clifford's 212, with Lieutenant Richard H. O'Brien in 205, left Bern on the night of May 10th to patrol Cape Bon. On the way home after a dull night, the 2 boats cut deep into the Gulf of Tunis to keep clear of a British destroyer area. The Gulf of Tunis was supposed to belong to torpedo boats that night, but 2 British destroyers came roaring out of the night on an opposite course, only 900 yards away. The destroyers opened up with machine guns as they passed, so the PTs fired 2 emergency recognition star shells and ran away behind a smokescreen. 2 German E-boats, lurking in the darkness for a crack at the 2 destroyers, opened up on the PTs instead, and the British took all the torpedo boats under fire, distributing shells and bullets on American and German boats with impartiality. The 2 PT skippers were given the thorny tactical problem of dodging friendly destroyer fire while simultaneously taking on the German boats. Lieutenant Clifford turned back through his own smoke, surprised the E-boats at close range when he burst out of the screen and raked the enemy with his machine gun batteries. He ran back into the smoke before they could swing their mounts to bear on him, so he couldn't report results of his attack, but destroyer sailors saw one of the E-boats burst into flame. The other ran from the fight. Not so the destroyers. They chased the PTs for an hour, firing star shells and salvos from their main battery. Fortunately, their shooting was poor, and the PTs got out of the battle with only a few machine gun holes. Days later, one of the destroyer skippers called to apologize. "We hadn't been able to find any action in our assigned patrol area," he said, "so we decided to have a bit of a look in the PT area." The destroyer skipper's action was dashing and bold, but it was also a fine way to catch a friendly torpedo in his own ship, or to kill a dozen or so of his allies. 3 E-boats had attacked the destroyers at the precise instant that the American PTs arrived on the scene. According to the British officer who had heard a German radio discussion of a plan to attack the destroyers. Naturally, the alarmed British began blasting at any torpedo boat in sight. Everybody saw Dubos's recognition flares, but took them for tracer fire, a common mistake. A strange aftermath of the running gun battle was the naval occupation of the great port of Bizerte by a lone PT. The 205 lost the other boat in the night and put into Bizerte for gasoline. The port had just been taken by Allied troops a few hours earlier. The shore batteries, now in friendly hands, nevertheless fired the customary few rounds at the arriving PT boat, but the imperturbable Lieutenant O'Brien said, "The shots were wide, so I continued in and tied up at the dock." 2 hours later, a newsreel photographer asked O'Brien to move his PT out of the way so he could photograph some British landing ships just arriving as the first Allied craft to enter Bizerte. Lieutenant O'Brien wondered what his own boat was, if not an Allied craft, and he had been in Bizerte long enough to be bored with the place, but he patiently moved aside. The brush-off from the newsreel man was only the beginning of the stepchild treatment the PTs suffered at Bizerte. Squadron 15 cleaned up a hangar and scrounged spare parts and machinery from all over the city. When the big boys came into the harbor, their skippers were delighted with the tidy PT base and ruthlessly pushed the little boys out the door. "We cleaned up half the buildings in Bizerte," said one veteran of Squadron 15. "As fast as we made a place presentable, we were kicked out. We ended up with only a fraction of our original space, and we had to fight tooth and nail for that." Late in May, the squadron was filled out to full strength, and the newly arrived boats were fitted with radar. The British boats did not have it, so the 2 torpedo boat fleets began to experiment with a system of radio signals to vector British boats to American radar targets in coordinated simultaneous attacks. After the collapse of the Africa Corps in Tunisia in mid-May 1943, all of North Africa was in Allied hands and Allied attention turned toward Europe across the Narrow Sea. To mislead the enemy about the spot chosen by the Allies for the next landing, British secret agents of the Royal Navy elaborated a fantastic hoax worthy of the cheapest dime novel. The amazing thing is that it worked. The British dressed the corpse of a man who had died of pneumonia in the uniform of a major in the Royal Marines. They stuffed his pockets with forged credentials as a Major William Martin, and they planted forged letters on the body to make him look like a courier between the highest Allied commands. The letters revealed that the Allies would next land in Sardinia and Greece. The body was pushed overboard from a submarine off the coast of Spain. It washed up on the beach as an apparent victim of a plane crash and was frisked by an Axis agent, just as the British had hoped. Hitler was taken in by the hoax and gave priority to reinforcing Sardinia and Greece, widely separated not only from each other, but also from Sicily, where the Allies were actually going to land. To help along the confusion of Axis officers, most of whom were of a less romantic nature than their forwer and were not taken in by the Major William Martin fraud, the Allies mounted another hoax almost as childishly imaginative as the planted cadaver trick. On D-Day, July 10, 1943, Commander Hunter R. Robinson in PT 213 led a flotilla of 10 Air Force crash boats to Cape Granatola, at the far western tip of Sicily, as far as it could get from the true landing beaches around both sides of the southeastern horn of the triangular island. The crash boats and the PT were supposed to charge about offshore during the early hours of D-Day, sending out phony radio messages, firing rockets, playing phonograph records of rattling anchor chains and the clanking and chuffing of landing craft engines. The demonstration didn't seem to fool anybody ashore, but the little craft tried. Most of Squadron 15 was busy elsewhere on the morning of D-Day and narrowly missed being butchered in one of those ghastly attacks from friendly forces that were so dangerous to PT boats. One force of American soldiers was going ashore at Licata. 24 miles west, at Port Empedicle, was a flotilla of Italian torpedo boats, which so worried the High Command that Empedicle had been ruled out as a possible landing beach. To keep the Italian boats off the back of the main naval force, a special screen was thrown between Port Empedicle and the transport fleet, a screen of 17 of Lieutenant Commander Barnes' PTs and the destroyer Ordronaux. After the war, historians discovered that the much-feared Italian torpedo boats at Empedicle had accidentally bumped into the invasion fleet the night before the landings and had fled in panic to a new base at Trapani at the farthest western tip of the island. Another one of those terrible blind battles between friendly forces was prepared when nobody told the westernmost destroyers of the main landing force that PTs would be operating nearby. The skippers of the destroyers Swanson and Rowe, nervous anyway because of the Italian torpedo boat nest at Empedicle, charged into the PT patrol area when they saw radar pips on their screens. Lieutenant Commander Barnes flashed a recognition signal, but the destroyer signal crews ignored it. Just as the destroyer unit commander was about to open fire at 1,500 yards, Rowe rammed Swanson at the forward stack. Rowe's bow folded up and both ships went dead in the water. The Swanson's forward fire room was partly flooded. Both ships had to be sent to the rear for repairs, carrying with them, of course, their 5-inch cannon, which were sorely missed by the assault troops of that morning's landings. 2 nights later, on July 12th, Lieutenant Commander Barnes split his PTs into 2 forces to escort 12 crash boats for another fraudulent demonstration of strength at Cape Granitola. The 2 forces ran parallel to the beach behind smoke and noisily imitated the din of a force 1,000 times their true size. Searchlights blazed out from the shore, and the second salvo from shore batteries landed so close to the boats that the skippers hauled out to sea. The shore batteries were completely alerted, said Lieutenant Commander Barnes. Apparently, the enemy was convinced that a landing was about to take place when it detected the large number of boats in our group approaching the beach, for they opened a heavy and accurate fire with radar control. I immediately reversed course and opened the range. 1 shell damaged the rudder of a crash boat, and another fell 10 yards astern of a PT. The demonstration was called a success, and we withdrew. The next day, enemy newspapers reported that an attempted landing on the southwest coast of Sicily had been bloodily repulsed. Soldiers of the American and British landing forces swarmed over Sicily, taking Italian prisoners by the hundreds. Some Americans were amused, some depressed by the standard joke of many surrendering Italian soldiers. "Don't be sorry for me. I'm going to America, and you're staying in Sicily." Palermo, major city on the northwestern coast, fell to the Allies on July 22nd, and the jaunty boats of Squadron 15 were the first Allied naval power to show the flag in the harbor. They picked their way through the sunken hulks of 50 ships. The dockside was a shambles. In a word, Palermo was a typical PT advanced base. The squadron moved up from Bizerte the same day and began patrolling the Tyrrhenian Sea, those waters boxed in by Sicily, Italy, Sardinia, and Corsica. Isolated in the Tyrrhenian Sea, about 30 miles north of Palermo, is the island of Ustica. On the first Tyrrhenian patrol, Lieutenant Commander Barnes led his boats toward Ustica to see what was going on in those backwaters of the war. "At dawn, we were off Ustica," the squadron leader reports. "First thing, we saw a fishing boat putting toward Italy. We found a handful of very scared individuals crawling out from under the floor plates, hopefully waving white handkerchiefs. This was the staff of an Italian admiral at Trapani, site of the Italian torpedo boat base at the western tip of Sicily, bypassed by the fall of Palermo. Only reason we didn't get the admiral was that he was late getting down to the dock, and his staff said the hell with him. In addition to a few souvenir pistols and binoculars, we captured a whole fruit crate of 1,000-lira notes, which we reluctantly turned over to army authorities later. One of the other boats saw a raft with 7 Germans on it, feebly paddling out to sea. We picked them up too. The next night, 3 PTs of Squadron 15 patrolled to the Strait of Messina, right against the toe of the Italian mainland itself, and 2 nights later, off Cape Vaticano, the same 3 boats, under Lieutenant E.A. Arbuckle, found the 8,800-ton Italian freighter Viminale being towed toward Naples by a tug. For some reason, the freighter was being towed backward, almost causing the PT skippers to take a lead in the wrong direction. But they sank both ships in the first U.S. naval victory in the Tyrrhenian Sea. On the night of July 26th, near the island of Stromboli, 3 PTs commanded by Lieutenant J.B. Moody ran into their first F-lighters, those powerfully armed German landing craft and general-duty blockade runners that were to become the #1 enemy of PTs in the Mediterranean. The F-lighters were slow and cumbersome, but they were armored and mounted extremely heavy anti-aircraft batteries, which could saw a PT into toothpicks. Gun turrets were lined with cement and often mounted the much-feared 88mm rifle, thus enormously outgunning the PTs. Holds of the F-lighters were so well compartmented that they could take terrible punishment without going down. With only 4½ feet of draft, they usually slid over PT torpedoes, set to run at 8-foot depth. An F-lighter was a serious opponent for a destroyer, and much more than a match for a PT, in theory. The 3 PT skippers at Stromboli didn't know about that theory, however, and probably wouldn't have hesitated about attacking even if they had known how dangerous an F-lighter was. They fired 6 fish and thought they had blown up 2 of the F-lighters, but post-war assessment says no. Neither side was badly hurt in this first duel, but more serious fighting was to come. The next night, July 28th, 3 boats commanded by Lieutenant Arbuckle fired at what the skippers thought were F-lighters, but were really Italian torpedo boats. American torpedoes passed harmlessly under the hulls of the enemy boats. Italian machine gunners punched 60 holes in PT-218 and seriously wounded 3 officers, including Lieutenant Arbuckle. The boat got back to Palermo with 18 inches of water sloshing about below decks. The F-lighters were ferrying Axis troops out of Sicily across the Strait of Messina. The Allied High Command had hoped to catch the whole Axis force on Sicily in a gigantic trap, and the Messina ferry had to be broken up. The Navy tried a combined torpedo boat-destroyer operation against the ferry, but as usual, communications between the American ships were bad, and the destroyers opened fire on their own PTs. The first salvo from the American destroyers splashed water on the PT decks. The PTs were 5 knots slower than the American cans. Remember those news stories in the early days of the war about the dazzling 70-knot PTs, fast enough to run rings around any warship afloat? During the summer of 1943, few of the Squadron 15 boats could top 25 to 27 knots. Because they couldn't run away from their deadly friends, and because they feared American gunnery more than they feared Italian gunnery, the PT boats actually ran for the enemy shore to snuggle under the protection of Italian batteries on Cape Rossacolmo. The enemy guns obligingly fired on the American destroyers and drove them away. The PT sailors went home, enormously grateful to the enemy for his involuntary but effective act of goodwill. In August, the Axis powers ferried most of their power to the mainland across the 3-mile-wide Strait of Messina, in a brilliant escape from the Sicilian trap. PT skippers knew about the evacuation, but had orders to stay away from the scene. British torpedo boats that tried to break up the evacuation train were badly mauled by shore batteries. One torpedo boat disappeared, with all hands, in the flash of a direct hit from a gigantic 9½ inch shell. Chafing at the order that kept it out of the action, the PT command dreamed up an operation to relieve the tedium. It decided to mount an invasion of its own to capture an island. Setting up a jury-rig invasion staff, the officers pored over charts, looking for the ideal enemy island to add to the PT bag. Lieutenant Dubose, returning from a fight with German minesweepers on the night of August 15th, picked up an Italian merchant seaman from a small boat off Lipari Island in the Aeolian Group, a few miles northwest of the Strait of Messina. The sailor said there were no Germans on Lipari, and the islanders would undoubtedly be delighted to be captured by the American Navy. When the admiral heard the squadron's proposal, he radioed, "Demand the unconditional surrender of the islands, suppress any opposition, bring back as prisoners all who are out of sympathy." 3 PTs, their crews beefed up by 17 extra sailors, 6 soldiers, and a military government man, with a destroyer following behind as main fire support, sailed into Lipari Harbor at 11 a.m. on August 17th, guns manned and trained on the beach. At precisely the critical moment, the destroyer hove into view around a headland, giving the impression of a mighty fleet backing up the puny invaders. The commandant of the Italian naval garrison came down to the dock himself to handle mooring lines for his captors. The American military government man stepped gracefully ashore in the first assault wave and set up a government on the spot. PT men rounded up military prisoners, hauled down the Italian, and hoisted the American flag. The Italian commodore slipped off in the excitement and tried to burn his papers, but a sailor persuaded him to stop by pressing the muzzle of a .45 automatic to his brow. Sailors confiscated the documents and collected souvenirs, while the commandant radioed the other islands in the group, and the PT skippers accepted their surrender by long distance. Only Stromboli resisted, so the PTs chugged over to find out what was holding up the breaking out of peace on that volcanic pimple. They found an Italian chief petty officer and a 30-man detail blowing up their radio equipment. The American sailors indignantly halted the sabotage, then destroyed the stuff themselves. All the Italian Navy saboteurs were put under armed guard for transport to American prisons in Sicily, but a pregnant woman burst into sobs, pleading that one of the men was her husband, a fisherman who had never spent a night away from Stromboli in his life. 6 other women joined their wails to the chorus. The local priest assured Lieutenant Dubose that their stories were true, so Dubose granted the prisoners a reprieve. The boats returned to Lipari, picked up 50 merry military prisoners there, and departed for Palermo to the cheers of the entire town. Messina fell that same day, and the Sicilian campaign was over. 3 weeks after the fall of Sicily, on the morning of September 9th, Allied troops went ashore in force on the mainland around the magnificent Bay of Salerno, just across a headland from Naples, second port of Italy. Invasion chores were not strenuous for the PTs. A little anti-E-boat patrol in the bay, and some light courier and taxi service for Army and Navy brass. Dull duty, but the boats had to fly low and slow because they were almost out of aviation gasoline. Their tanker had failed to arrive on schedule. By October 4th, however, the gasoline was in, and the British had taken a splendid harbor at La Maddalena, off northeast Sardinia. So Squadron 15 sailed to Sardinia, from where it and the British boats could prey on enemy traffic north of Naples. Almost immediately, part of Squadron 15 moved still farther north to Bastia, on Corsica, which the Free French had just taken back from the enemy. These 2 bases put PTs on the flanks of coastal shipping lanes deep in the heart of enemy waters. Genoa itself, the largest port in Italy, was now within reach of the squadron's torpedoes. Hunting was especially good in the Tuscan archipelago, a group of islets and rocks between the PT base and the mainland. Something had to be done about the PT torpedoes, however, for the squadron was equipped with old Mark 8s built in the 1920s, crotchety, unreliable, and worst of all, designed to run so far below the surface that they couldn't touch a shallow draft F-lighter. PT torpedomen tinkered with their fish to set them for a shallow run. But the Mark 8 was frisky without 8 feet of water to hold it down. The shallow-set Mark 8s porpoised, alternately leaping from the water and diving like sportive dolphins. PT skippers set them shallow anyhow and fired them with the idea that there was a 50-50 chance the porpoising torpedo would be on the upswing when it got to the target and might at least punch a hole in the side. In Italy, as the contending armies fought slowly up the peninsula, the German situation became somewhat like the Japanese situation at that same moment in New Guinea. Powerful Allied airstrikes disrupted supply by rail from Genoa and Rome to the front, so the Germans had to rely on waterborne transport to run down the coast at night. To protect themselves from marauding Allied destroyers, the Germans fenced off a channel close to the shore with a barrier of thousands of underwater mines. At salient points, they mounted heavy, radar-directed cannon, some as big as 9 1/2 inches in bore, to keep raiding destroyers pushed away from the mine-protected channel. The minefields worked. Deep-draft destroyers did not dare chase Axis vessels too close to the beach. The shallow-bottom PTs skimmed over the top of the minefields, however, so the Germans countered by arming many types of small ships as anti-PT boats. They took over a type of Italian warship called a torpedo boat, but actually a small destroyer, fast and heavily gunned, eminently qualified for PT elimination work. Night patrols became lively, with PTs harrying Axis coastal shipping and the Germans hunting them with E-boats and armed minesweepers, torpedo boats, and F-lighters. The first brawl after the PTs set up base on Sardinia and Corsica came on the night between October 22nd and 23rd. 3 PTs, under the indefatigable Lieutenant Dubose, sneaked up on a cargo ship, escorted by 4 E-boats and minesweepers. The PTs fired a silent spread of 4, and the cargo ship disappeared in a violent blast. Lieutenant Junior Grade T.L. Sinclair was lining up his 212 to work a little more destruction when a wobbly, out-of-control Mark 8 torpedo from another PT flashed by under his stern. "How many have you fired?" Lieutenant Dubose asked Lieutenant Sinclair by radio. "None yet. I'm too damned busy dodging yours." Between Giglio and Elba, in the Tuscan archipelago, on the night between November 2nd and 3rd, 2 PTs, under Lieutenant Richard H. O'Brien, made a torpedo run on a subchaser and blew a satisfactorily fatal hole in the hull with a solid hit. The stricken vessel went down, all right, but it went down fighting, and one of the last incendiary bullets from the dying ship bored through the gasoline tank of the 207, touching off an explosion that blew off a deck hatch. Flames as high as the radar mast shot through the open hatchway. A radio man turned on a fire extinguisher, threw it into the flaming compartment, and slammed down the hatch again. Miraculously, the fire went out. Early in November, Lieutenant Commander Barnes, who had been doing some deep thinking about the war against F-lighters, came up with a new tactical idea. His reasoning was, PTs are radar-equipped, hence better than British boats at finding enemy vessels and maneuvering for attack. British torpedo boats use better torpedoes than American Mark 8s, for they are faster and carry heavier explosive charges. British gunboats have heavier firepower than PTs, for they usually carry at least 6-pounder cannon, and so can take on heavier opponents. So Lieutenant Commander Barnes and his British counterpart worked out a scheme of joint patrolling, the Americans acting as a scout force and finding targets by radar. The targets once found, the PTs were to guide the British boats in a coordinated attack. From November 1943 until April 1944, joint patrols had 14 actions, in which skippers claimed 15 F-lighters, 2 E-boats, a tug, and an oil barge sunk, 3 F-lighters, a destroyer, a trawler, and an E-boat damaged. As winter came on, winds mounted and seas ran high, but the PTs maintained their patrols. On the foul night of November 29th, Lieutenant Junior Grade Eugene A. Clifford took his 204 out with another PT for a patrol near Genoa. Within 2 hours, the wind built up to 35 knots. Water smashed over the bow in blinding sheets and drowned out the radar. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. The PTs gave up the patrol and turned back toward Bastia. In the stormy night, the boats were separated, and the 204 plugged along alone, lookouts almost blinded by the spray. Out of the darkness, 4 E-boats appeared within slingshot range, laboring on an opposite course. A 5th E-boat crossed the T, but not fast enough, for the PT and the E-boat struck each other a glancing blow with their bows. From a 10-yard range, the 2 small craft ripped into each other with every gun that would bear. The other 4 E-boats joined the affray, and for 15 seconds, the 204 was battered from broad-jumping distance by the concentrated fire of 5 enemy boats. The PT escaped in the darkness, and the crew set about counting its wounds. Bullets had torn up torpedo tubes, ventilators, ammunition lockers, gun mounts. The deck and the superstructure were a ruin of splinters. The engine room had 100 new and undesired ventilation apertures. The skipper polled his crew to prepare the melancholy roll of dead and wounded. Not a man had been nicked. The gas tank was intact. The engines still purred along like electric clocks. The 204, outnumbered 5-1, had stood up to a 15-second eyeball-to-eyeball Donnybrook and was nevertheless bringing all its sailors home in good health. 2 of the squadron's PTs were detached in January 1944 and went south again for duty in the ill-fated Anzio landing. Lieutenant General Mark Clark, commanding the 5th American Army, wanted the boats for water taxi duty between the main American lines near Naples and the Anzio beachhead, 30 miles south of Rome. Usually the taxi runs were dull for sailors of the PT temperament, but not always. On the morning of January 28th, General Clark and some of his staff boarded Lieutenant Junior Grade George Patterson's 201 at the mouth of the Volturno River, and in company with 216 set sail for Anzio, 75 miles to the north. 25 miles south of Anzio, the minesweeper Sway patrolled the southern approaches to the beachhead. The captain had just been warned that enemy airplanes were attacking Anzio, and he knew that the Germans often coordinated air and E-boat strikes. So when he saw two small boats ripping along at high speed and coming down the sun's track, he challenged them by blinker light. Without reducing speed, Lieutenant Patterson answered with a 6-inch light, too small a light for that distance in the daylight. Besides, the signalmen on the Sway were partly blinded by the glare of the sun, just rising behind the 201. Sway's guns opened fire. Lieutenant Patterson fired an emergency recognition flare, but it burst directly in the face of the sun, and the Sway's bridge crew missed the second friendly signal from the torpedo boat. The 201 even reduced speed as a further friendly gesture, but the slower speed only made the boat a better target. The next shot hit the boat in the chart house, wounding Lieutenant Patterson and his executive officer, Ensign Paul B. Benson, and killing an officer passenger and a sailor. "Let's get the hell out of here," suggested General Clark. Ensign Benson, though wounded, took the wheel from the sagging skipper and zigzagged the boat away at high speed back toward Naples until he was out of range of the Sway's batteries. A few miles down the coast, the crew of 201 transferred dead and wounded to a British minesweeper. The Sway still stood between the boat and Anzio, but General Clark wanted to go to the Anzio beach, so the 201 crept back at a peaceful-looking speed and spoke up from long distance with a bigger light. The sun was higher, Sway's signalman read the message, and the skipper waved them by. Lieutenant Commander Barnes still restlessly experimented with armaments and tactics, looking for a combination of weapons and methods that would counter the dangerous weapons of the F-lighters. Rocket launchers were being mounted on landing craft, and the small vessels were delivering devastating ripples on enemy beaches. Their firepower was all out of proportion to the size of the craft. A few PTs were playing around with rocket launchers in the Pacific. "It's worth at least a try," thought Lieutenant Commander Barnes. On the night of February 18th, 1944, Barnes went out in Lieutenant Junior Grade Page H. Tulloch's 211 with Lieutenant Robert B. Reeder's 203 and Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert D. McLeod's 202. As Lieutenant Commander Barnes tells the story, "I saw a small radar target come out from behind the peninsula and head over toward one of the small islands south of Giglio. Thinking it might be an F-lighter, I ordered rocket racks loaded. He must have seen us because whatever it was, probably an E-boat, speeded up and ducked into the island before we could make contact. That presented the first difficulty of a rocket installation. There we were with the racks all loaded and the safety pins out. The weather had picked up a little, and getting those pins back in the rockets and the racks unloaded was going to be a touchy job in the pitch dark, on wet, tossing decks. I decided to leave them there for a while to see what would happen. About midnight, it started to kick up a good deal more. I had just about decided that whatever it was we were looking for wasn't going to show up, and I was getting pretty worried about the rockets heaving out of the racks and rolling around in a semi-armed condition on deck. I decided to take one last turn around our patrol area and head for the barn. On our last southerly leg, we picked up a target coming north at about 8 knots, and I closed right away, thinking to spend all our rockets on whatever it was. As we got closer, it appeared to be 2 small targets in column, a conclusion which I later used as an outstanding example of don't trust your interpretation of radar too blindly. Just about the time we got to the 1,000-yard firing range, the lookout started reporting vessels everywhere, all the way from our port back around to our starboard bow. I had arranged the other 2 boats on either side in line abreast and ordered them to stand by to fire on my order over the radio. I gave the order, and we all let go together. During the 11 seconds the rockets were in flight, nobody fired a shot, but a couple of seconds after the rockets landed, what seemed like a dozen enemy craft opened up. The formation was probably 3 or 4 F-lighters escorted by 2 groups of E-boats. We had passed through the 2 groups of escorts on our way to our firing position. Now it was time to turn away, and as my boat turned to the right, we found that the 202 was steaming right into the convoy. To avoid collision, we had to turn back and parallel the 202. Just at that time, the engines on my boat started to labor and unbelievably coughed and died, all 3 of them. We were smack dab in the center of the whole outfit, with the enemy shooting from all sides. The volume was terrific. The 203 had lost all electric power, including the radar and compass lights. She saw the 2 of us off our original course and came back to join us, making a wide circle at high speed and laying smoke. It is impossible to say exactly what happened. The melee was too terrific. The 202 had a jammed rudder, which they were able to clear. She eventually got out by ducking around several vessels, passing as close as 100 yards. The 203 likewise got out by ducking in and out of the enemy formation, but we on the 211 just sat there helpless, watching the whole show. This business lasted for at least 4 or 5 minutes, and even the shore batteries came in to illuminate with star shells. Fortunately, there was enough smoke in the air to keep the issue confused. That confusion was the only thing that saved us. None of our boats was using guns at all, and it was obvious that the enemy was frightfully confused with us weaving through the formation. They were hard at work shooting each other up. I am sure they sank at least one of the E-boats, because several minutes later they started firing again off to the north, and there was a large gasoline fire in the channel, which burned for a long time. We got clear by the simple process of just sitting still and letting the enemy pass around us and continue north. I finally got one engine engaged and went to our rendezvous, which was only a couple of miles away. But by the time I got there, I could just see the other 2 boats on the radar screen leaving. I tried to call them back, but I couldn't get a soul and waited around for some time thinking they would come back. They didn't, however, and went on back individually, for which they got a little private hell from me later. I had no alternative but to go back myself. I expected to find the other 2 boats pretty well shot up, as it was a miracle that we weren't lost ourselves. Strangely enough, I found that they were not damaged, and except for the fantastic coincidence of all 3 of us being more or less disabled simultaneously, we were okay. Apparently, the rockets did no damage, and further installation of rocket racks on his PTs was firmly rejected by Lieutenant Commander Barnes. The American PT commander was not the only one concerned about the heavy ordnance of the F-lighters. Captain J. F. Stevens of the British Navy's coastal forces in the Mediterranean said, "While coastal forces are the most suitable forces to operate in mined areas, the enemy has so strengthened his escorts and armed his shipping that our coastal craft find themselves up against considerably heavier metal. Furthermore, the enemy's use of F-lighters of shallow draft does not provide good torpedo targets. Everything that can be done to improve our chances of successful attack is being done. Torpedoes will, if possible, be fired at even shallower settings. Meanwhile, if they cannot achieve destruction, coastal forces will harry the enemy and endeavor to cause him the utmost possible alarm, damage, and casualties." Officers at La Maddalena gave longer thought to the problem and came up with an idea called Operation Gun. Lieutenant Commander Barnes' combined operation, the plan to use American radar for scouting and conning heavier-armed British boats to targets, had been a promising beginning, but even the MBG gunboats were not a real match for the F-lighters. Commander Robert A. Allen, British Commandant of the Sardinia base, cut 3 landing craft out of the British amphibious fleet and armed them with 4.7 naval guns and 40mm autocannon. The landing craft were big, flat-bottomed tubs, wonderful platforms for the hard-hitting 4.7 inchers. To man the guns, he assigned crack gunners of the Royal Marine Artillery. Commander Allen organized an interesting task force around the 3 landing craft gunboats, designated LCGs, as his main battle line. They were screened against E-boat attack by British torpedo boats and controlled by the radar-equipped American PT scouting force. Commander Allen himself went out on the first sweep of his beefed-up inshore patrol on the night of March 27th. He rode Lieutenant Junior Grade Thaddeus Grundy's PT-218 so that he could use American radar to assign targets to his gunboats and give them opening salvo ranges and bearings by remote control. When the gunboat battle line arrived off San Vincenzo, south of Leghorn, a scouting group of 2 PTs under Lieutenant DeBose went off on a fast sweep, looking for targets. At 10 p.m., the PTs had found 6 F-lighters going south, and Commander Allen brought his main battle force up quickly to intercept them. At 11 p.m., Lieutenant DuBose sharply warned the main force that 2 destroyers were escorting the lighters on the seaward side. "I am preparing to attack the destroyers," he added. Commander Allen continues the story. "Until he carried out this attack, it was not possible for us to engage the convoy, as our star shells being fired inshore over the target would illuminate us for the escorting destroyers, which were even farther to seaward than we were. Fire was therefore withheld during several anxious minutes. During this 10-minute wait for the PT scouts to take on the destroyers, both the German forces, escort, and convoy came on Commander Allen's radar screen. The PT scouts crept to within 400 yards before firing torpedoes and ran away behind heavy smoke. Nevertheless, the destroyers laid down such a heavy fire that they hit 214, even in the smoke screen, wounding the engineer of the watch, Joseph F. Grossman, and damaging the center engine. Grossman ignored his wounds and tended the stricken engine until it was running well again, staying below with his engines until the boat was out of danger. The skippers of the scouting PTs heard the usual large explosions on one of the destroyers and hoped they had scored, but couldn't be sure. Hit or no hit, the destroyers reversed course and ran up the coast, abandoning their convoy, an unthinkable act of cowardice for Allied escorts. Sunk or run off, it was all the same to Commander Allen, who wanted only a free hand with the F-lighters. When the destroyers were gone, he passed radar ranges and bearings to the gunboats, and the Royal Marines lit up the night over the convoy with a perfect spread of star shells. Startled gunners on the F-lighters, unused to this kind of treatment in waters where vessels with 4.7-inch guns had never dared venture before, took the lights for plane flares and fired wildly into the clouds. The Royal Marine gunners took their time for careful aim under the bright glare of the slowly sinking magnesium lights. At the first salvo, one of the F-lighters blew up with a tremendous explosion. Within 10 minutes, 3 F-lighters were burning briskly. The gunboats spread out and pinned the surviving boats against the beach, while the Marine artillerymen methodically pounded them to scrap. Of the 6 F-lighters destroyed, says Commander Allen, 2, judging by the impressive explosions, were carrying petrol, 2 ammunition, and 1 a mixed cargo of both. With what sounds like a note of wistful disappointment, Commander Allen added, "The 6th sank without exploding." The Operation Gun Task Force sortied again on the night of April 24th. The coastal waters around the Tuscan archipelago were swarming with traffic that night. Early in the evening, the gunboats blew 2 F-lighters out of the water. Burning debris, cascading from the sky after the explosions, set fires on the beach. Shortly afterward, the Marine sharpshooters picked off a tug and 3 more F-lighters. Radar picked up still another group, and star shell from the gunboats showed that they were 3 flak lighters, medium-sized craft powerfully armed as anti-aircraft escorts for daylight convoys. The Royal Marine gunners smacked their first salvos into 2 of the flak lighters, which burned in a fury of exploding ammunition. The 3rd lighter poured an astonishing volume of fire at the unarmored gunboats, and Commander Allen, in PT-218, made a fast run at the enemy to draw fire away from his gunboats. The Marines put a shell into the flak lighter, and it ran off behind smoke, but the 209 led a charge through the smoke, fired off its fish, caught the flak ship squarely amidships, and blew it in 2. Lieutenant Dubose's scouting torpedo boats found a convoy escorted by a flak lighter, but at that moment, the gunboats were engaged in another fight. So rather than break up the show of the main battle line, the PTs attacked the enemy themselves. At least 1 of 3 fish connected, for the flak lighter blew up in a jarring explosion. Ashore, 50 miles away at Bastia, squadron mates sat outdoors to watch the flash and glare of the all-night battle against the eastern sky. Things were just threatening to get dull after midnight when shore radio at Bastia called Commander Allen with a radar contact report of an Axis convoy between the gunboats and Corsica. The PTs got there first and found 2 destroyers and an E-boat in column. When the PTs were still 2,500 yards away, too far for a good torpedo shot from a small boat, the destroyers fired a star shell. PT-202 was ready for just that emergency. A sailor standing by with a captured 5-star recognition flare fired the correct answering lights and calmed the enemy's nerves. The PTs moved in under the guise of friends and fired 4 fish at 1,700 yards. As they ran away, they felt a violent underwater explosion, so they claimed a possible hit. On this one wild night of action, Commander Allen's strange little navy had, without damage to itself, sunk 5 of the formidable F-lighters, 4 heavily armed flak lighters, and a tug, scored a possible torpedo hit on a destroyer, and pulled a dozen German prisoners from the water. Hearts of the PT sailors were lifted with joy in May 1944, when the Mark 13 torpedoes began to trickle into their bases, and the heavy old-fashioned torpedo tubes were replaced with light launching racks that gave the boats badly needed extra bursts of speed. More boats had been arriving too, and eventually there were 3 PT squadrons working out of Sardinia and Corsica. As torpedo men installed the new fish and the new launching rigs, a PT skipper rubbed his hands and said, "Wait till we get a good target now. These Mark 13s are going to sweep these waters clean." Lieutenant Eugene A. Clifford, in 204, led 2 other PTs in the first attack with the new torpedoes on the night of May 18th in the Tuscan archipelago. The PTs had 2 flak lighters on their radar scopes. Determined to try out the new torpedoes, they bored through the massive barrage from the flak lighters' anti-aircraft guns, firing from 1,000 yards. One of the highly vaunted Mark 13s made a typical Mark 8 run and hit the 204 in the stern. Fortunately, when this Mark 13 goofed, it really goofed. So it did not explode, but punched through the PT's skin and lodged its warhead inside. Its body dangled in the PT's wake, like a sucker fish clamped to a shark's tail. Lewis H. Rigsby went into the lazarette to stuff towels into the vanes of the impeller to keep the torpedo from arming and exploding. The flak lighters chased the PTs and hit 204 with 20mm fire, but the boat escaped behind smoke, one of the famous Mark 13 torpedoes bobbing and dangling from the stern. Dominating the Tuscan archipelago, within sight of the Italian mainland, is the island of Elba, first home of Napoleon in exile. The island attracted the Allies because big guns on the point closest to the mainland could reach the coastal road and also close off the inshore passage to coastal craft. Once Elba was in Allied hands, southbound Axis land traffic might be chased a few miles inland to less developed mountain roads, and sea traffic would certainly be squeezed into the 30 miles of water between 2 Allied bases at Elba and Corsica. One problem annoyed the planners of the Elba landings: what to do for naval support. The waters around Elba were probably the most heavily mined on the Italian coast, and deep-draft ships could not be risked there. But then, hadn't PTs been scooting about the coast of Elba for 9 months? On the night between June 16th and 17th, 37 PTs joined other shallow-draft vessels of the coastal force to support landings of Senegalese troops of the French 9th Colonial Division, plus mixed elements from other Allied forces. 5 PTs approached the northern coast at midnight and about a half-mile from shore put 87 French raiders in the water in rubber rafts. The 5 PTs joined another quintet at the farthest northeast point of Elba, the point closest to the mainland. At 2 a.m., 3 of the 10 PTs went roaring along the northern coast, smoke generators wide open and smoke pots dropping over the side in a steady stream. When the shoreline was sealed off behind a 16,000-yard curtain of smoke, 4 more PTs moved down the seaward side, with loudspeakers blaring the sounds of a great fleet of landing craft. The PTs launched occasional ripples of rockets at the beach to imitate a pre-invasion shore bombardment. The 3 remaining PT skippers carried on a lively radio exchange, straining their imaginations to invent a torrent of orders for an imaginary invasion armada. Searchlights from the beach swept the water, looking for a hole in the screen. Land guns on the shore and in the mountains to the west poured shells into the smoke screen, thus pinpointing themselves nicely for an Allied airstrike that slipped in just before dawn. At the true landing beach on the south coast, Lieutenant Junior Grade Eads Poitevent, Jr., captain of the 211, was posted as radar picket to guide landing craft ashore. He was alarmed when he saw a radar target creep out of the harbor at Marina de Campo. He could not attack without alerting the beach, and yet the oncoming enemy vessel had to be kept away from the landing flotilla at any cost. Poitevent boldly sailed close to the target, an E-boat, and made friendly-looking signals on a blinker light. He eased off in a direction away from the convoy, luring the patrol into harmless waters. It took him 15 minutes to tease the E-boat off the scene and return to his duties. The E-boat would not stay away, however, and in its aimless wanderings, it blundered across the path of a PT with a deckload of British commandos destined for a pre-invasion landing. The commandos slipped over the side, 3/4 of a mile farther out than they had planned, and silently paddled their rubber boats successfully to the beach around the lackadaisical enemy patrol. Another PT saw the E-boat also, and thinking it was a friendly, tried to form up in column. Lieutenant Junior Grade Harold J. Nugent on 210, who was following the bumbling drama on radar, broke radio silence just long enough to cheep the smallest of warnings to his squadron mate. The E-boat crew incredibly fumbled about those waters, teeming with Allied boats, for most of the night, and never lost their happy belief that they were alone with the stars and the sea. PT radar scopes now showed a more interesting target. Coming right up the patrol line was something big, in fact, a formation of big ships, so PT skippers prepared for a torpedo attack. They held back, however, for full identification of the targets because the ships could just possibly be the invasion flotilla, slightly off course. At 400 yards, Nugent challenged the approaching formation by blinker. The nearest vessel answered correctly, and a few seconds later repeated the correct code phrase for the period. Lieutenant Nugent continues. Being convinced that the ships were part of the invasion convoy, which had probably become lost, I called to my executive officer, Lieutenant Junior Grade Joel W. Bloom, to be ready to look up the ship's correct position in our copy of the invasion plan. I brought the 210 up to the starboard side of the nearest ship, took off my helmet, put the megaphone to my mouth, and called over, "What ship are you?" I shall never forget the answer. First, there was a string of guttural words, followed by a broadside from the ship's 2 88mm guns and 5 or 6 20mm guns. The first blast carried the megaphone away and tore the right side off a pair of binoculars that I was wearing around my neck. It also tore through the bridge of the boat, jamming the helm, knocking out the bridge engine controls, and scoring a direct hit on the 3 engine emergency cutout switches, which stopped the engines. I immediately gave the order to open fire, and though we were dead in the water and had no way of controlling the boat, she was in such a position as to deliver a full broadside. After a few minutes of heavy fire, we had reduced the firepower of the closest ship to one wildly wavering 20mm and one 88mm cannon, which continued to fire over our heads throughout the engagement. It was easy to identify the ships as the scene was well lighted with tracers. They were 3 ships traveling in a close V, an E-boat in the center with an F-lighter on either flank. We were engaging the F-lighter on the starboard flank of the formation. As the ship started to move toward our stern, the injured F-lighter screened us from the fire of the other 2 ships, so I gave the order to cease fire. In the ensuing silence, we clearly heard screams and cries from the F-lighter. 2 members of our engine room crew, who were topside as gun loaders during battle, were sent to the engine room to take over the chief engineer's duties, for I was sure he was dead or wounded. However, he had been working on the engines throughout the battle and had already found the trouble. We immediately got underway. We found out, however, that our rudder was jammed in a dead-ahead position, but by great good fortune, we were headed directly away from the enemy. So I dropped a couple of smoke pots over the side, and we moved off. The enemy shifted its fire to the smoke pots, and we lay to and started repairs. Much to our surprise, we found that none of us had even been wounded, but the boat had absorbed a great deal of punishment. A burst of 20 millimeter had zipped through the chart house, torn the chart table to bits, knocked out the lighting system, and detuned and scarred the radio and radar. Another burst had gone through the engine room, damaged control panels, torn the hull. All hits, however, were above the waterline. Turrets, turret lockers, ventilators, and the deck were holed. We called the 209 alongside and sent off a radio report to the flagship on the action and the direction in which the ships retired. Lieutenant Nugent learned from the skipper of the 209 that his boat had been hit only twice, but one of the shells had scored a direct hit on a 40mm gun loader and killed him instantly. The tall, black warriors from French Senegal swept over the island in 2 days of brisk fighting, and Elba was allied. The sea roads to the south were blocked, and PT action shifted to the north, to the Ligurian Sea, the Gulf of Genoa, and the lovely blue waters off the Côte d'Azur.
This concludes today's reading of The Mosquito Fleet by Bern Keating, presented by Major Antonio. Join us also next week for the subsequent chapter, or download the entire audiobook from our webshop at antonio.net. Thank you for listening, and so long.